Welcome to Craftlit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from where the Delaware River meets the Old York Road, New Hope, Pennsylvania. Episode 548, Vintage Allen. This episode of Craftlit is brought to you by you. Thank you. Well, hello. How are you? I am well. I am being crafty in a very strange way this week. All of my craftiness has been aimed at creating Excel VBA macro buttons. This is not the kind of craftiness that I wanted to do this week. And yet, it turns out to be quite a thing. Unfortunately, it is not as soft as anything created by yarn, nor is it as pretty when I do it. I'm sure that there are some other people who make lovely macro buttons for Excel spreadsheets. And to you I say, well done. I am not in that camp. I am going for function over form this week. So, sadly, I have nothing particularly crafty to share with you. However, we do have two fabulous chapters for this week. Some vintage Allen, like a fine wine. Mrs. Allen is just, to quote, I believe, vintage Dennis Miller, she is busy but never precocious. And that is absolutely accurate for Mrs. Allen. Ooh, but first, we have a voicemail from Jennifer. Thursday night, Jennifer. I miss you guys too. Thursdays have been really, really hard at work because everything always comes down to it has to be ready to go by Friday, and everything that we do depends on other people getting their parts done, which of course isn't ever going to happen until the last minute. So by the 6:30 on Thursday night, I am either drinking caffeine and powering through, or I am collapsing, which is more often the case. I have truly eaten dinner and never moved again until I am recording for you in the Friday morning. Least favorite part of this job. Love lots of other parts of it, but that is not one of my favorites. Regardless, we have an update. It's a different view of Bridgerton from Thursday Night Amy's. So here we go with Jennifer's review of the Bridgerton books.
Hi, Heather. This is Jennifer Gordon, Jenny Quilter on Ravelry. So I got a couple of things. I love Northanger Abbey. I'm, really looking forward to enjoying the rest of this. I understand that the rest of the world does not share my passion for Trollope, and I'm resigned to this. You asked about comments about Bridgerton. Last week, I had the horrible combination of dental surgery and painters in the house. So all my comfort books were packed or otherwise inaccessible, and I was drugged to the gills. So I bought online The Duke and I, a.k.a. Bridgerton #1. And I'm here to tell you that when you're full of opiates, The Duke and I is just fine. I think sober that I would rate it at about perhaps 1/2 Georgette. My sources tell me that they get better, the Bridgertons get better as you go along. The highlight for me for this was there's a chapter at the end that's, what's her name? I can never remember her name. Daphne and Simon, 20 years on, that's a little more fleshed out. I gather it was written, after the rest of the series. There's like the Bridgertons Happily Ever After. So she added those to the ebooks. So that's fun. The novel doesn't have all the subplots that we get in the TV show, and of course sadly lacks all the visuals that, so you're not exclaiming over everybody's dresses and the gentleman's, correct or incorrect costuming as well. So there you go. Hope to see you eventually. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
Jennifer, I am impressed that stuffed with opiates and paint fumes, you were able to pay attention to the book at all. But I love I love having a recommendation that begins with, well, when one is stuffed with opiates. And I'm glad you made it through your dental surgery as well. Congratulations. All right, I think next time I am really in desperate need of something light and fun, I'm gonna give the Duke and I a shot. Why not? Even if only to relive the visuals that will be in my mind for who they are and how they look, which is just marvelous. Okay, Northanger Abbey. Here we go. All right, in previous episodes, we've talked about the fact that Bath is, in fact, a real place, a real, quite lovely place, and it was visited by many, many people during the season, and the season generally stretched from late in the year, September, October, into the spring of the following year. There's another mineral bath, mineral water resort town in England, one that is considerably closer to London, and that is Tunbridge Wells. Tunbridge Wells has shown up in previous books that we have gone through together. And this case is no different. It's mentioned as a spa town. It's mentioned as a place to go. Its season, however, was over the summer. So it would be very possible for someone who was endowed financially in a way that allowed them to do this. They could spend the summer at Tunbridge Wells and then the season over the colder months over in Bath. The other thing about Bath being a real place, and not only a real place, but a real place that Jane Austen spent a considerable chunk of time both visiting and then living there, I think right before and after her father passed away in the early 1800s. There are true facts about Bath that she mentions. One of them very early on in our first chapter today, chapter 4, is she mentions a clock. This is a 9-foot tall clock. Sucker had been there since 1709. It is still there. So that's kind of cool. So it's in the pump room. When you walk in, there's a large open room, and the clock, I think it is still standing where it was standing, and that's in an alcove off to the side. Oh, and one other little Bath Tunbridge Wells tidbit. The Master of Ceremonies, Nash, who I mentioned, Beau in quotation marks, Nash, who I mentioned last week, he was also the MC at Tunbridge Wells. He got set up in Bath and then took that show on the road and set up Tunbridge Wells to have an MC as well. So Master of Ceremonies in both places to keep the riffraff away and to make sure that nothing untoward happened under their care to the young people who were having a lovely time. All right, so that takes care of the fun spa stuff. Austen is in fine form in the 2 chapters that we have today. And in fact, she hits 2 snark points that are really beautiful at the end of each chapter, or 1 snark point at the end of each chapter ends with a snarky bit, is what we're saying. In the first case, we have a play on the adage, it is better to give than to receive. Listen for that, because it is not used in a way that one would normally think one would be using that little proverbial adage. And at the end of chapter 4, you will hear Jane Austen explaining to us that because a character is not particularly wealthy, our narrator will not spend 3 or 4 chapters covering her backstory. She's just going to skip over it and take you to the next good bit about Catherine and Mrs. Allen and their story. Jane Austen is not saying this just 'cause. She is saying this because that was something that a particular author did in her novels, that there would be all this drama surrounding these people who you met, who were really not main characters. They were kind of side characters, But there are people who were getting paid by the word and other people who got paid by the page. And if you were one of those lucky people, you would pad your stories. Jane Austen was not that lucky, but she does get to dig in. So listen for that. End of chapter 4. You will also hear reference to lace on a pelisse. These were those I don't want to say coat because we have a certain thing that we think of when we say overcoat. It was a jacket, a Spencerian jacket, long sleeves, slightly puffy shoulders, empire waist, and then long and straight, just like these neoclassical kinds of gowns that the girls were all wearing at the time. A pelisse was a coat that you would wear over a dress, and it was shaped the same way that the dress was shaped, so they went very nicely together. They could be trimmed in lace, they could be trimmed in many ways. It was a take on a military jacket, so you often see the clasps that fasten it closed over the top would be like military frogs, that kind of thing. Not always, but sometimes. They're really quite lovely. And at this time period, I think they had come almost all the way to the ground. So they're quite long. Earlier in the Regency period, apparently they would come kind of mid-calf and then got longer from there. At the opening to chapter 5, you'll hear a notation about a divine service. That is in quotation marks for me because it is a proper noun. A divine service was a morning service at chapel. It was daily, evidently, in Bath. And of course, if you were a good girl, you would be expected to show up at divine service. It was short. It was before noon. It was not like what you did on Sundays, which was often 2 services, a morning and an early afternoon. But of course, a lovely, quiet way to start your day. Also, an excellent place to see and be seen, I am sure. You will hear reference to the Crescent. To all of you who have loved and watched Jane Austen movies or Regency era films that take place in and around Bath, you will recognize the reference to the Crescent. This was 30 homes, 30, 30 homes that were built over the span of, I think it was almost 10 years that it took to build the sucker. Big, white homes. Lovely. Built in, I know you're going to be shocked here, a crescent shape. And so they kind of bend around this lovely large green slope. So from these homes, you would have a spectacular view down over Bath. And of course, this lovely green, grassy knoll upon which one could, again, see and be seen by a better class of people, you know, as one does. So the Crescent gets brought up here. I think this might actually be the only time the Crescent is mentioned, to be honest. But either way, here we are early on getting our Crescent sighting in. A reminder, a curricle is a sporty little open carriage built for speed, can take 2 horses. So really built for speed. A reference to a Christian name is the same as your first name. It's the name that you were given when you were christened. So not your family name, not your last name, but your Christian name, your first name. You will hear a reference to dressed and undressed balls. This does not mean that people went to dressed balls wearing dresses and went to undressed balls wearing naught but a smile. This actually had more to do with dress versus fancy dress. Fancy dress, for those of you in the United States, it would be closer to a costume party. That doesn't mean that they were going to show up necessarily in masks or anything like that. It's you could have a little bit more fun with what you were wearing than you could at a dressed ball. A dress ball would be the slightly more formal one. According to one of the annotated texts that I have, the other annotated text kind of disagrees on some of the finer points of that. I have no opinion on the fact. I just know no one was naked at the undressed ball. And that was pretty much where I cared to stop in learning more about this. I figured, heck, they're sanctioned by the MC. They're going to be just fine. But there was a difference. And apparently also a difference in where the location was, although the upper rooms and the lower rooms each had their dressed and undressed balls. So there were plenty of opportunities for young folks to get together and dance together under the watchful and approving gaze of their elders, is all that that's talking about. There's also the Pump Room book. I think I mentioned this last week. The book is still there, not necessarily the historical one, but a new one, and you can sign your name in it when you go visit the Pump Room. The thing to know about it is it's supposed to be the record. Yes, we did talk about this because the Master of Ceremonies set this up. It's supposed to be the record of people who visited Bath. That would be people who visit for longer than a day or two, because you might not have time if you were just whizzing through on your way somewhere else or to do something. You might not have time to get to the pump room, get upstairs, fight your way through the crowd, sign your name in the book, only to turn around and leave. That would be kind of silly. So it turned out to be a really nice record of who's who in the present. You know, who's here visiting now. You can page back through the pump room book to see the names of the people who you might catch a glimpse of while you're there. That's all it is. Cant, the word C-A-N-T, no apostrophe, is used here in its classical sense, which is a stock or affected phrase. This is something that functions like a cliche. It is sometimes just a single word that's being used in a cliched sense. Kind of, it's in vogue, and so everybody is saying it. That kind of thing. And the last thing to be aware of, the end of chapter 5 is, according to one of the annotated comments in one of the annotated Northanger Abbeys that I have, the most often cited section or chunk of Jane Austen ever. So, out of all of her books, out of everything she's written, including Pride and Prejudice, the end of chapter 5 is the most often quoted, the most often cited section of Austen, hands down. Chunks of it also show up in the OED, again, for her use of language, which is exquisite. And we will talk more about why that particular section of chapter 5 is so frequently cited, but also so wonderful. It's just lovely. All right, so here we go. Chapters 4 and 5 of Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, read for us by the lovely Mad Gare.
Chapter 4. With more than usual eagerness did Catherine hasten to the pump room the next day, secure within herself of seeing Mr. Tilney there before the morning were over, and ready to meet him with a smile. But no smile was demanded. Mr. Tilney did not appear. Every creature in Bath except himself was to be seen in the room at different periods of the fashionable hours. Crowds of people were every moment passing in and out, up the steps and down, people whom nobody cared about and nobody wanted to see, and he only was absent. "What a delightful place Bath is," said Mrs. Allen, as they sat down near the great clock, after parading the room till they were tired, "and how pleasant it would be if we had any acquaintance here." This sentiment had been uttered so often in vain that Mrs. Allen had no particular reason to hope it would be followed with more advantage now. But we are told to despair of nothing we would attain, as unwearied diligence our point would gain. And the unwearied diligence with which she had every day wished for the same thing was at length to have its just reward. For hardly had she been seated 10 minutes before a lady of about her own age, who was sitting by her, and had been looking at her attentively for several minutes, addressed her with great complacence in these words: "I think, madam, I cannot be mistaken. It is a long time since I've had the pleasure of seeing you, but is your name not Allen?" This question answered, as it readily was, the stranger pronounced hers to be Thorpe, and Mrs. Allen immediately recognised the features of a former schoolfellow, an intimate, who she had seen only once since their respective marriages, and that many years ago. Their joy in this meeting was very great, as well it might, since they had been contented to know nothing of each other for the last 15 years. Compliments on good looks now passed, and after observing how time had slipped away since they were last together, how little they had thought of meeting in Bath, and what a pleasure it was to see an old friend, They proceeded to make inquiries and give intelligence as to their families, sisters and cousins, talking both together far more readily to give than to receive information, and each hearing very little of what the other said. Mrs. Thorpe, however, had one great advantage as a talker over Mrs. Allen, in a family of children. And when she expatiated on the talents of her sons and the beauty of her daughters, when she related their different situations and views, that John was at Oxford, Edward at Merchant Taylor's, and William at sea, and all of them more beloved and respected in their different stations than any other three beings ever were, Mrs. Allen had no similar information to give, no similar triumphs to press on the unwilling and unbelieving ear of her friend, and was forced to sit and appear to listen to all these maternal effusions, consoling herself, however, with the discovery which her keen eyes soon made, that the lace on Mrs. Thorpe's pelisse was not half so handsome as that on her own. "Here come my dear girls," cried Mrs. Thorpe, pointing at three smart-looking females, who, arm in arm, were then moving towards her. "My dear Mrs. Allen, I long to introduce them. They will be so delighted to see you. The tallest is Isabella, my eldest. Is she not a fine young woman? The others are much admired too, but I believe Isabella is the handsomest." The Miss Thorpes were introduced, and Miss Morland, who had been for a short time forgotten, was introduced likewise. The name seemed to strike them all, and after speaking to her with great civility, the eldest young lady observed aloud to the rest, "How excessively like her brother Miss Morland is!" "The very picture of him, indeed," cried her mother, "and I should have known her anywhere for his sister," was repeated by them all, 2 or 3 times over. For a moment Catherine was surprised, but Mrs. Thorpe and her daughters had scarcely begun the history of their acquaintance with Mr. James Morland before she remembered her eldest brother had lately formed an intimacy with a young man of his own college of the name of Thorpe, and that he had spent the last week of the Christmas vacation with his family near London. The whole being explained, many obliging things were said by the Miss Thorpes of their wish to be better acquainted with her, of being considered already friends through the friendship of their brother, etc., which Catherine heard with pleasure and answered with all the pretty expressions she could command. And, as the first proof of amity, she was soon invited to and accepted an arm of the eldest Miss Thorpe to take a turn with her about the room. Catherine was delighted with this extension of her Bath acquaintance, and almost forgot Mr. Tilney while she talked to Miss Thorpe. Friendship is certainly the finest balm for the pangs of disappointed love. Their conversation turned upon those subjects of which the free discussion had generally much to do in perfecting a sudden intimacy between two young ladies, such as dress, balls, flirtations, and quizzes. Miss Thorpe, however, being 4 years older than Miss Morland, and at least 4 years better informed, had very decided advantage in discussing such points. She could compare the balls of Bath with those of Tunbridge, its fashions with the fashions of London, and could rectify the opinions of her new friend in many articles of tasteful attire, could discover a flirtation between any gentleman and lady who only smiled on each other, and point out a quiz through the thickness of a crowd. These powers received due admiration from Catherine, to whom they were entirely new, and the respect which they naturally inspired might have been too great for familiarity, had not the easy gaiety of Miss Thorpe's manners and her frequent expressions of a delight on this acquaintance with her softened down every feeling of awe, and left nothing but tender affection. Their increasing attachment was not to be satisfied with half a dozen turns of the pump-room, but required, when they all quitted it together, that Miss Thorpe should accompany Miss Morland to the very door of Mr. Allen's house, and that they should there part with a most affectionate and lengthened shake of the hands, after learning to their mutual relief that they should see each other across the theatre that night, and say their prayers in the same chapel the next morning. Catherine then ran directly upstairs and watched Miss Thorpe's progress down the street from the drawing-room window, admired the grateful spirit of her walk and fashionable air of her figure and dress, and felt grateful, as well she might, for the chance which had procured her such a friend. Mrs. Thorpe was a widow, and not a very rich one. She was a good-humoured, well-meaning woman, and a very indulgent mother. Her eldest daughter had great personal beauty, and the younger ones, by pretending to be as handsome as their sister, imitating her air and dressing in the same style, did very well. This brief account of the family is intended to supersede the necessity of a long and minute detail from Mrs. Thorpe herself on her past adventures and sufferings, which might otherwise be expected to occupy the 3 or 4 following chapters, in which the worthlessness of lords and attorneys might be set forth, and conversations which had passed 20 years before be minutely repeated. Chapter 5. Catherine was not so much engaged at the theatre that evening, in returning the nods and smiles of Miss Thorpe, though they certainly claimed much of her leisure, as to forget to look with an inquiring eye for Mr. Tilney in every box which her eye could reach. But she looked in vain. Mr. Tilney was no fonder of the play than the pump-room. She hoped to be more fortunate the next day, and when her wishes for fine weather were answered by seeing a beautiful morning, she hardly felt a doubt of it. For a fine Sunday in Bath empties every house of its inhabitants, and all the world appears on such occasion to walk about and tell their acquaintance what a charming day it is. As soon as divine service was over, the Thorpes and Allens eagerly joined each other, and after staying long enough in the pump-room to discover that the crowd was unsupportable, and that there was not a genteel face to be seen, which everybody discovers every Sunday throughout the season, they hastened away to the Crescent, to breathe the fresh air of better company. Here Catherine and Isabella, arm in arm, again tasted the sweets of friendship in an unreserved conversation. They talked much, and with much enjoyment, but again Catherine was disappointed in her hope of re-seeing her partner. He was nowhere to be met with. Every search for him was equally unsuccessful, in morning lounges or evening assemblies, neither at the upper or lower rooms, at dressed or undressed balls was he perceivable, nor among the walkers, the horsemen, or the curricle drivers of the morning. His name was not in the pump-room book, and curiosity could do no more. He must be gone from Bath. Yet he had not mentioned that his stay would be so short. This sort of mysteriousness, which is always so becoming in a hero, threw a fresh grace in Catherine's imagination around his person and manners, and increased her anxiety to know more of him. From the Thorpes she could learn nothing, for they had been only 2 days in Bath before they met with Mrs. Allen. It was a subject, however, in which she often indulged with her fair friend, from whom she received every possible encouragement to continue to think of him, and his impression on her fancy was not suffered therefore to weaken. Isabella was very sure that he must be a charming young man, and was equally sure that he must have been delighted with her dear Catherine, and would therefore shortly return. She liked him the better for being a clergyman, for she must confess herself very partial to the profession, and something like a sigh escaped her as she said it. Perhaps Catherine was wrong in not demanding the cause of that gentle emotion, but she was not experienced enough in the finesse of love or the duties of friendship to know when delicate raillery was properly called for, or when a confidence should be forced. Mrs. Allen was now quite happy, quite satisfied with Bath. She had found some acquaintance, had been so lucky, too, as to find them in the family of a most worthy old friend, and as the completion of good fortune had found these friends by no means so expensively dressed as herself. Her daily expressions were no longer, "I wish we had some acquaintance in Bath." They were changed to, "How glad I am to have met with Mrs. Thorpe." And she was as eager in promoting the intercourse of the two families as her young charge and Isabella themselves could be, never satisfied with the day unless she spent the chief of it by the side of Mrs. Thorpe, in what they called conversation, but in which there was scarcely ever any exchange of opinion, and not often any resemblance of subject, for Mrs. Thorpe talked chiefly of her children, and Mrs. Allen of her gowns. The progress of the friendship between Catherine and Isabella was quick as its beginnings had been warm, and they passed so rapidly through every gradation of increasing tenderness that there was shortly no fresh proof of it to be given to their friends or themselves. They called each other by their Christian name, and were always arm in arm when they walked, pinned up each other's train for the dance, and were not to be divided in the set. And if a rainy morning deprived them of other enjoyments, they were still resolute in meeting in defiance of wet and dirt, and shut themselves up and read novels together. Yes, novels, for I will not adopt that ungenerous and impolitic custom so common with novel writers of degrading by their contemptuous censure the very performances to the number of which they are themselves adding, joining with their greatest enemies of bestowing the harshest epithets on such works, and scarcely ever permitting them to be read by their own heroine, who, if she accidentally take up a novel, is sure to turn over its insipid pages with disgust. Alas, if the heroine of one novel cannot be patronised by the heroine of another, From whom can she expect protection and regard? I cannot approve of it. Let us leave it to the reviewers to abuse such effusions of fancy at their leisure, and over every new novel to talk in threadbare strains of the trash with which the press now groans. Let us not desert one another. We are an injured body. Although our productions have afforded more extensive and unaffected pleasure than those of any other literary corporation in the world, no species of composition has been so much decried. From pride, ignorance, or fashion, our foes are almost as many as our readers. And while the abilities of the 900th abridger of the history of England, or of the man who collects and publishes in a volume some dozen lines of Milton, Pope, and Prior, with a paper from the Spectator and a chapter from Sterne, are eulogised by 1,000 pens, there seems almost a general wish of decrying the capacity and undervaluing the labour of the novelist, and of slighting the performances which have only genius, wit, and taste to recommend them. I am no novel reader. I seldom look into novels. Do not imagine that I often read novels. It is really very well for a novel. Such is the common cant. And what are you reading, miss? Oh, it's only a novel, replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with affected indifference or momentary shame. It's only Cecilia, or Camilla, or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humour are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language. Now, had the same young lady been engaged with a volume of The Spectator instead of such a work, how proudly would she have produced the book and told its name, though the chances must be against her being occupied by any part of that voluminous publication, of which either the matter or the manner would not disgust a young person of taste. The substance of its papers, so often consisting in a statement of improbable circumstances, unnatural characters, and topics of conversation, which no longer concern anyone living, and their language, too, frequently so coarse as to give no very favourable idea of the age that could endure it.
All right, we're going to talk about that at the end. Let's go back to the beginning of chapter 4. Mrs. Allen has a friend. I suppose the best way to describe it is that they have a lovely time talking at each other, but never actually conversing about the same thing. There is no give and take in this relationship at all, and yet they seem to be perfectly happy to see each other and sit there and not talk with one another. This is the only place where I felt that the movie version of the story did not live up to the promise of the novel. I think it probably would have been quite difficult to make a scene out of these two characters that didn't look mean, to find a way to have them not speaking with each other, but speaking at each other, and have it come across as anything other than small-minded and petty, I think would have been quite difficult. Doable, but difficult. So in this case, this just has to be left up to our own imaginations about how beautiful that image is of these two women. It just makes me happy. And we have been introduced to Isabella, Catherine's very good friend. A couple things to say about Isabella here. She's about 21. Catherine's about 17. Catherine has made it clear, and will continue to make this clear throughout the book, that she comes from a small place, a rural place called Fullerton, which is outside Salisbury. Catherine says at some point during the book, I think she already mentioned it, that Mrs. Allen is pretty much the only person who she can go visit near home, which gives you an idea of how few friends of her own age she would have access to, aside from the children in the family, of which there are, 10 in total. So she has 9 other playmates, but not really another friend her age who she can, be a confidant with. So this has got to be extraordinary for her. And I loved that scene of Isabella leaving to walk home and Catherine watching her walk away through the window, because here she finally has a friend, and it's sweet. And Isabella is an interesting character on her own. Jane Austen does a marvelous job writing her in a way that the actress who plays her in the film version clearly picked up on beautifully. She has Isabella using young colloquial language all over the place. So I'm going to read I'm going to read a line of this with emphasis on particular syllables. So so you can hear what I mean. Talking about the people, Mr. Tilney and other people who are showing up in Bath. Isabella was very sure that he must be a charming young man, and was equally sure that he must have been delighted with her dear Catherine, and would therefore shortly return. This is, yes, it's the narrator telling us about their conversation, and yes, it is the narrator using Isabella's language to kind of poke fun at Isabella's language, and this continues throughout the book. So it's a lot of fun. But it also allows our narrator to make some interesting comments about the expectations of how young girls or young women are supposed to behave and communicate with each other when they have a guy who they particularly like. You're supposed to tease each other about it. You're supposed to understand the knowing glances that pass between two people. Catherine picks up on none of this, ever, at all. She is completely without guile. Isabella has some guile lessons to give. She knows her way around people, and there are several marvelous moments throughout the book where Jane Austen takes advantage of their differences to have some fun with us. Oh, and there's a term I forgot to tell you about before. So in this book, all over at least the first half of this book, there will be references made to quizzing and quizzes and quizzers. People who were odd, eccentric, interesting, funny could be referred to as quizzes or quizzers. There was some conversation by book editors about which ones Jane Austen meant where. And so we have, we hope, an accurate spelling of the word the way Jane Austen meant it to be. We don't know for certain because she used the word different ways in different places. So it's not necessarily going up to somebody and asking them questions like, how many marbles are in this jar? It would have been more asking them questions because they were an odd or interesting person, and taking the time to talk to them would be at least diverting as entertainment. So I told you the end of chapter 4 was going to include the narrator telling us that she was going to skip the next 3 or 4 chapters of backstory on Mrs. Thorpe. The author that Jane Austen is particularly poking fun at here is Charlotte Smith, and she wrote Emmeline and Ethelind. Emmeline was 1788, Ethelind 1789. Popular books, very popular books, which Jane Austen read and enjoyed. But she was one of the people who was getting paid by the word, I think. So good old Charlotte Smith made some money and a little bit more by padding out her stories with not particularly important, but evidently quite interesting descriptions about smaller characters' backstories. And that leads us up to the spectacular end of chapter 5. We talked a little bit way back at the beginning about novels and the reputation that novels carried with it, not just through this time period, but for much longer. Everybody was reading them. Nobody was admitting to it. And here Jane Austen steps forward as she herself, the narrator, to say, hey, ladies, the last people on earth who should be putting words into characters' mouths along the lines of, oh, it's just a novel, or, oh, I'd never read something like a novel. Putting those words into your heroine's mouth in the novel you're writing really isn't doing any of us any good. This is a huge feminist manifesto at the time. This is, by the way, post Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication on the Rights of Women. So there is no huge surprise to me that Jane Austen would come forth with this. And evidently, it is not a surprise to anyone who is scholarly in the world of Jane Austen either. It is merely the sum total of all of Jane Austen's feelings of frustration at the end of her career with the way women novelists had treated each other in their own books. So she is not above stooping to tease Charlotte Smith about padding out her novels for money, but she also is not having our heroine and her best friend reading novels and poo-pooing them or being embarrassed to be caught with them. No, in fact, she is quite clear they are reading novels in this book that were popular at the time that the story was taking place, which is a bit of a different take on the whole thing and very Austinian. And she also leaves off at the end with the let's not attack each other, let's leave that to the critics. Because, of course, her books drew some praise and some criticisms, and she knew the same would happen with this book as well. After her death, however, when Northanger Abbey was finally published, critical response to the book from the annotations that I've been reading seems to have been pretty positive. I haven't come across anything yet that indicates that the critics were self-aware enough to realize that she was kind of taking a dig at them. I can't tell yet, but if I come across a really good review that lets it be known that they either completely missed the subtext or they got it, I will share that with you when I find it. All right, that is chapter 4 and 5. Some vintage Alan for you, some new Isabella for you, and poor Mr. Tilney. We haven't seen Mr. Tilney. We miss Mr. Tilney. Where's Mr. Tilney? All right, until next week, I hope you have a great one. Take care, be well, be safe, wear a mask, get a vaccine. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. If you like what you hear on Craftlit, please review us on iTunes, like us on Facebook, join in the fun in our Facebook group, which is Craftlit Annotated Audiobooks. Always the nicest group of people you're going to find on Facebook, and the place where you can come to and say, nobody else was going to understand this, but I knew you all would. And of course, thank you for your support of Craftlit. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one on.